So some of my cases recently have included the issue of appropriate adults in police custody. And so this is a very brief recording in relation to some of the issues around appropriate adults and those who are mentally vulnerable. So if we can imagine the scenario, a person is brought into police custody, the first thing to establish is, have they been detained under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act? So they've been brought to the place of safety aspect, or have they been arrested and they're being brought to police custody in relation to being pursued in relation to a crime or inquiries about a crime? So therefore they're detained under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984. Now, the principle is the custody sergeant rules the roost, and anybody else involved in the process merely acts as guidance and advice to the custody officer. But the custody officer's primary role is to ensure the safety and the PACE compliance for the detained person. So it's Code C of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act which is relevant for the person being detained in police custody. And the custody officer must perform functions in relation to the codes of practice that go with the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. Now, that's quite clear in that code that if there's any suspicion of mentally vulnerable, in the absence of clear evidence to dispel that suspicion, that person needs to be dealt with as a mentally vulnerable person. Now, where confusion sometimes happens then, the person might be appearing to have mental ill health issues for the police. So they then call a healthcare professional to come and have an initial assessment of the person, because they might then be wanting guidance and advice in relation to, do we need to then pursue this further to a Mental Health Act formal assessment? So in the initial response, the healthcare professional might be a doctor, or it might be a custody nurse or a custody paramedic. All of those different roles all come under the heading of healthcare professional. So the healthcare professional turning up, now this isn't a person who's trained under the likes of the PIP levels for professionalising investigations, and neither are they thinking from the investigative strategy or in relation to PACE. They are healthcare professionals and are primarily looking at this person in relation to health and care under the likes of the Mental Health Act and the Mental Capacity Act, not thinking about PACE and the investigative process that the police are focused on. So the healthcare professional might have that initial screening assessment with the person and decide that there's no grounds in relation to pursuing an assessment under the Mental Health Act. But that doesn't negate the need to establish that the person is still mentally vulnerable in relation to the codes of practice under PACE and the requirement for an appropriate adult. So the healthcare professional might then tick their sheet in relation to appropriate adult and say no. However, their advice there is just advice. It's not a mandatory instruction to the custody sergeant. So the custody sergeant then receiving that takes it into consideration, but ultimately they are the ones that are responsible for making that decision, that do they still deem this person to be mentally vulnerable? And the issue around mental vulnerability in relation to Code C is that the person may not understand the significance of either what's being said to them or the significance of their responses or lack of responses, which may then mean that the person gives misleading information or self-incriminating information. And that's where sometimes the confusion happens. The custody sergeant sees from the healthcare professional, they've ticked no appropriate adult, and then just goes along with that thinking that they've instructed them. But it's the custody sergeant's decision in relation to everything around that detainee. Every other discipline that's involved in the process is merely advisory to the custody sergeant. So the decision rests with the custody officer. Now, if then the appropriate adult is brought, the next area sometimes is that the appropriate adult acts very passively throughout the process. But the appropriate adult can inspect the custody record as soon as is reasonably practicable at the custody office, And they can also see the risk assessment in relation to the person, because they may be able to provide relevant advice and guidance to the custody staff as well. And again, it's all about your Article 2 compliance in relation to positive obligations and involving as many people as possible in the risk assessment part. So if the appropriate adult is this person's nearest and dearest and next of kin, then they can facilitate the best possible communication process between the investigation staff and the detainee. And it's also about acting in the best interests of the detainee. You have trained appropriate adults who are available, but sometimes the relative who has got the trust and understanding and who knows the detainee can actually be the better appropriate adult if they're suitably briefed in relation to what their role actually is. It's not just to sit quietly at the back of the room and not get involved. They're there to give advice and assistance to the detainee, to act in the best interests of the detainee and to facilitate that communication. So it's just about that clarity of roles, and that your healthcare professional, they're there primarily assessing the health and the care of the detainee in relation to being mentally disordered or mentally capacitated, so the Mental Capacity Act side or the Mental Health Act side. And they're also under the guidance from the British Medical Association guidance in relation to what advice they give. And even in the British Medical Association guidance, it states that the responsibility for initiating the appropriate adults is in relation to the custody officer. So bringing it back, there's a difference between someone who is mentally vulnerable and the issues around mentally disordered. Mentally disordered comes under the Mental Health Act, or there's issues in relation to capacity under the Mental Capacity Act, whereas a custody staff and custody sergeant in relation to the investigative process and the dealings within police custody, they need to be thinking about mental vulnerability, which then means a lot more people really fall into that mentally vulnerable category. Now, hopefully that's a very quick tutorial in relation to mental vulnerability within the police custody area. I'm quite happy to discuss it further if anyone wants to.